The wind howled through the cracks in the Hollowfield farmhouse, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It was October 1847, and the nights had grown long in the Missouri Hollow, where the sisters, Eleanor, 19, and Clara, 16, shared a narrow bed in the attic room. Their parents slept below, in the warmth of the kitchen hearth, but up here the air bit cold, seeping under the eaves like an uninvited guest. Eleanor, the elder, lay awake first that night, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, eyes fixed on the slanted ceiling beams. She was the cautious one, always mending hems before they frayed or banking the fire early to save coal. Clara, beside her, breathed evenly, her freckled face slack in sleep, curls escaping the nightcap that never stayed put. A creak sounded from the stairs, faint as a mouse's step. Eleanor tensed, listening. The house settled oddly in the wind, but this was different, deliberate, like boots on warped wood. Thud. Pause. Thud. It climbed, slow and unhurried, each step echoing up the narrow flight. Clara stirred, murmuring something about the cow needing milking at dawn. Eleanor pressed a hand to her sister's arm, whispering, "Hush. Did you hear?" Clara's eyes snapped open, green and wide in the moonlight slanting through the single window. "Pa. That you?" But their father's tread was heavier, a farmer's stomp worn from fields of corn and tobacco. This was lighter, almost tiptoeing, yet insistent. The sisters sat up, the quilt pooling at their waists, hearts quickening in the chill. The footsteps reached the landing, just beyond the attic door, a thin slab of pine, unlatched as always. Thud. They stopped. Silence stretched, thick as fog over the hollow. Eleanor glanced at the door, its shadow unmoving in the dim. "Maybe it's the wind," she said, voice steady for Clara's sake, though her fingers twisted the sheet. Clara shook her head, slipping from the bed to pad barefoot across the floorboards. She was the brave one, the one who'd climb the windmill for a lost kite or chase foxes from the henhouse with a stick. "I'll look," she said, reaching for the lantern on the hook. "Don't." Eleanor's whisper sharpened. But Clara was already turning the knob, the door groaning open to reveal the empty landing, stairs descending into shadow. Nothing. No figure, no draft carrying a stranger's breath. The house held its quiet, save for the wind's distant moan. Clara peered down, then up at the rafters, as if the steps might belong to some attic sprite from their mother's old tales. "Gone," she said, closing the door with a soft click. "Probably just the place settling. You know how it groans after rain." They climbed back under the covers, but sleep evaded them. Eleanor lay staring at the ceiling, where cobwebs trembled like veils. Clara fidgeted, recounting the day's chores, the butter churned too thin, the sow that wouldn't eat, to fill the quiet. Yet the unease lingered, a prickle at the nape, as if the air remembered those halted steps. Below, their parents' snores rumbled faintly, oblivious. The sisters didn't speak of it then, not wanting to stir needless fear in a house already strained by lean harvests and whispers of fever in the neighboring towns. By morning, the incident blurred into the rhythm of dawn. Eleanor rose first, kindling the stove while Clara fed the chickens, their laughter chasing away the night's chill as they teased each other over burnt porridge. The hollow stretched around them, mist-cloaked hills dotted with skeletal oaks, the creek murmuring secrets to the stones. But as the sun climbed, Eleanor caught Clara glancing at the attic stairs, her usual spark dimmed by a shadow of doubt. The footsteps had stopped at their door, after all, not at the parents' room, not wandering the hall. Just there, listening, perhaps, before vanishing into the walls. That evening, as dusk painted the sky bruise purple, the creaks returned. Thud. Pause. Thud. Up the stairs, unhurried. The sisters froze in their bed, the quilt clutched tight. Clara's hand found Eleanor's, cold and clammy. The steps reached the landing. Stopped. The door's shadow held still, the silence heavier now, pressing like a hand on the chest. No wind this time, just the hollow house, and whatever walked its bones. The lantern's flame flickered low in the cramped attic room, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the rafters. Eliza clutched the edge of the quilt, her knuckles white, while Clara pressed close, her breath shallow against her sister's neck. The footsteps had come again last night, heavier this time, pausing just beyond the thin door that separated their sleeping nook from the rest of the Hollowfield farmhouse. They hadn't dared whisper about it until dawn broke, gray and reluctant over the moors. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of damp wool and yesterday's porridge. Mother Hollowfield stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, her face lined from years of tending sheep in the biting winds. Father was already out, his boots crunching toward the fields before the sun had fully risen. Eliza waited until Mother's back turned before leaning toward Clara. "It wasn't a dream," she murmured, her voice barely above the sizzle of oats. "I felt the floorboards creak, right under the threshold." Clara nodded, her dark curls matted from restless sleep. At 13, she was the bolder of the two, with a spark in her eyes that belied the fear knotting her stomach. "We tell Mother today. No more waiting." But as the words left her lips, doubt crept in. Mother, with her tales of restless spirits from the old country, might dismiss it as fancy, or worse, scold them for imagining things in the dead of night. The morning dragged under a sky heavy with clouds, the sisters trailing Mother to the barn where the ewes lowed softly. Eliza's hands trembled as she scattered feed, her mind replaying the sound, thud, thud, pause. Clara, ever the quick one, slipped away when Mother bent to mend a fence, beckoning Eliza behind a stack of hay bales. "Listen," she said, pulling a small knife from her apron, the one Father had given her for carving whittles. "Tonight, we don't hide. We watch the door." Eliza's heart quickened. The knife's blade caught the dim light filtering through the slats, sharp and unyielding. What if it's not a ghost? What if it's a fox, or a tramp from the road? Her voice wavered, but Clara's grip on her arm steadied her. "Then we chase it off. Together." Clara's words carried the weight of their shared secret, forged in the long evenings when Father read from his worn Bible by the fire. They were Hollowfields, bound by blood and the wild land that pressed against their door. As the sun dipped low, painting the hills in bruised purples, the sisters helped prepare the evening meal. Mother hummed an old lullaby, oblivious, her apron dusted with flour. Father returned with mud caked on his trousers, grumbling about a lame ewe. Dinner passed in tense silence, the clink of spoons against bowls echoing like distant echoes. Eliza stole glances at Clara, who nodded subtly, "Tonight." The house settled into quiet as the clock struck 10. Up in the attic, the sisters huddled under the quilt, the lantern extinguished to avoid drawing attention. The air grew thick, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain from the open window. Eliza's pulse thrummed in her ears, louder than the wind rustling the thatch. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the darkness pressing close. Then it came, a soft scrape, like leather on wood, from the stairs below. Thud. Thud. Slower than before, deliberate. Clara's hand found Eliza's, squeezing hard. The steps ascended, each one vibrating through the floor, until they halted, right outside the door. The knob didn't turn, but the pause lingered, heavy as a held breath. Something shifted in the silence, a faint rustle, as if whatever stood there leaned closer, listening. Eliza bit her lip to stifle a gasp. Clara, knife clutched beneath the covers, whispered, "Now." She threw back the quilt and lunged toward the door, flinging it open with a creak that split the night. The landing was empty, the stairs descending into shadow. No figure, no sound but the sudden patter of rain against the roof. Clara stepped forward, knife raised, peering down into the gloom. Eliza followed, her bare feet cold on the planks. "It's gone," Clara said, but her voice trembled, the bravado cracking. They descended together, hearts pounding, the knife glinting in Clara's fist. The lower hall was still, Father's snores rumbling from the parlor. But as they reached the front door, a chill draft slipped through the cracks, carrying a whisper of movement outside. Eliza froze, pointing to the mud-tracked floor. fresh prints, too large for any animal, leading toward the window. Before they could react, a low groan echoed from the moors, wind, or something more. Clara barred the door with a chair, her face pale. "We can't tell them yet. Not until we know." But as they retreated upstairs, the footsteps resumed below, faint and retreating, as if mocking their failed vigil. Sleep evaded them, the night stretching on with the promise of more unanswered questions. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught, casting long shadows that clawed at the walls of the sisters' bedroom. Eliza pressed her ear to the floorboards, her breath shallow, while Clara huddled under the quilt, her fingers twisting the hem like a lifeline. It was the third night since the footsteps had started, each one heavier than the last, as if whatever made them carried the weight of the house itself. Downstairs, the Hollowfield manor creaked under the autumn wind, but up here, in the attic room they'd claimed as their own, the silence between steps felt like a held breath. "Do you hear it?" Eliza whispered, her voice barely cutting the dark. She was the elder by 2 years, at 14, with a stubborn jaw and eyes that dared the night to frighten her. But tonight, even she couldn't hide the tremor in her hands as she traced the grain of the wood, searching for some hidden seam or whisper of movement below. Clara nodded, her face pale as the moon slicing through the cracked windowpane. "It's closer. Like it's climbing the stairs now." She pulled the quilt tighter, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. Their parents had laughed it off the night before, father calling it the wind playing tricks, mother insisting it was just the old pipes settling. But the girls knew better. Pipes didn't pause at the threshold, didn't hover just beyond the frame before retreating. Eliza sat up, rubbing her arms against the chill that seeped from the walls. The room smelled of damp stone and the faint, earthy rot from the woods beyond the estate. Hollowfield had been their home since grandfather's death last spring, inherited with its sprawling fields and secrets buried in the soil. The sisters had always felt the house watching them, but this was different, personal, like footsteps measured to their rhythm. "We can't just wait for it again," Eliza said, her words firm despite the knot in her stomach. "Last night, it stopped right here. If we listen close, maybe we can figure where it's coming from." Clara shook her head, her braids whipping against the pillow. "What if it's not from somewhere? What if it's us? Like the stories nurse tells about restless spirits." Her voice cracked, and she glanced at the family Bible on the nightstand, its leather cover worn from father's nightly readings. But prayers hadn't stopped the steps before, they'd only made the pauses longer, more deliberate. The first footfall echoed then, faint but unmistakable, from the hallway below. Thud. The sisters froze, the lantern's light flickering as if in sympathy. Eliza crept to the door, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, and pressed her palm against the wood. It vibrated slightly, not from the wind, but from something passing beneath. Thud. Closer now, ascending the narrow stairs that led only to their room. Clara slipped from the bed, joining her sister, their shoulders touching for warmth and courage. "It's coming," Clara breathed, her caution warring with a spark of defiance. She wasn't one for bold plans, preferring the safety of daylight chores, tending the herb garden or mending hems, but fear had sharpened her senses, made her notice the way the floorboards groaned in patterns no living person would follow. Eliza turned the knob slowly, the metal icy under her fingers, and cracked the door just enough to peer into the gloom. The hallway stretched empty, lit only by the weak glow from a single candle on the landing below. Thud. The sound reverberated through the banister, and the shadow seemed to shift at the edge of vision, not quite a shape, but a distortion, like heat rising from a hearth. "There," Eliza hissed, pointing. But when Clara leaned forward, nothing moved, the air hung still, heavy with the scent of wet leaves carried from outside. They waited, hearts pounding in unison, until the steps reached the top, thud, and stopped. Dead silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl in the hollow below the house. The door, ajar, swung imperceptibly inward, as if nudged by an unseen breath. Eliza's hand shot out to grab Clara's, pulling her back. "Don't," she warned, though her own pulse raced like a trapped bird. From the darkness beyond the threshold, a soft scrape followed, not a foot, but nails on wood, testing, probing. Clara stifled a gasp, her mind flashing to the attic's forgotten corners, where grandfather's old trunks gathered dust and cobwebs. Had something followed them up from there? The scrape grew insistent, circling the doorframe, and then, abruptly, it ceased. Footsteps retreated, descending with the same measured pace, fading into the house's bowels. The sisters slammed the door shut, Eliza barring it with a chair from the corner. They collapsed onto the bed, breathless, the lantern now a feeble sentinel. "It's playing with us," Clara murmured, her voice laced with a new edge, not just fear, but resolve. For the first time, she reached for the small knife father had given Eliza for whittling, its blade glinting in the low light. Eliza nodded, her bravery tempered by the night's revelations. The footsteps weren't random, they sought the sisters, halting at their bed as if drawn by blood or whisper. Downstairs, the house settled into quiet, but the girls lay awake, plotting in hushed tones, a trip to the cellar at dawn, perhaps, or enlisting the stable boy who knew the manor's hidden passages. Whatever haunted Hollowfield had grown bolder, and ignoring it no longer felt like an option. As the first gray light of morning crept through the window, illuminating the faint scratches now visible on the doorframe, they knew the steps would return, hungrier for answers of their own. Eleanor clutched the edge of the quilt, her knuckles whitening as the floorboards creaked once more from the hallway beyond their door. The sound was deliberate, like boots scraping against worn oak, heavier than father's step or mother's soft shuffle in her nightgown. Beside her, Clara lay rigid, her breath shallow and quick, the faint outline of her face pale in the sliver of moonlight sneaking through the curtains. "It's closer tonight," Clara whispered, her voice barely threading the silence. She didn't turn her head, eyes fixed on the door's brass knob, as if willing it not to move. Eleanor swallowed, tasting the dust of the attic air they'd carried down earlier that day. The hollows under their eyes from sleepless nights made them look like ghosts in the mirror, but she pushed the thought away. "We can't just wait. Remember what we found up there, the old trunk with the letters. Aunt Beatrice wrote about the wanderer who never quite left." Clara shifted, the bedsprings groaning in protest. "Letters from 100 years ago. What if it's all stories to scare children? But those footsteps, they stop right here. Every night." The creak came again, nearer now, pausing just outside. Eleanor's heart hammered, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached under the pillow for the iron poker they'd smuggled from the fireplace, its cold weight grounding her. Brave, that's what she was supposed to be, the elder by 2 years, the one who climbed trees and chased off stray dogs. But tonight, bravery felt like a thin veil over terror. "Listen," Clara hissed, sitting up. Her dark curls tangled around her shoulders, wild from tossing. "It's not moving. It's waiting." Eleanor nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. The house in Hollowfield had stood for generations, its walls whispering secrets since grandfather's time. Father dismissed their fears as fancy, too buried in his ledgers from the mill to notice the shadows lengthening unnaturally at dusk. Mother, with her frail health, prescribed tonics and early bedtimes, as if medicine could silence the unseen. Another step, soft this time, like a sigh against the threshold. The knob didn't turn, but the air grew thicker, carrying a chill that seeped through the cracks. Eleanor's grip tightened on the poker. "We go out there. Together. If it's nothing, we sleep. If it's something, we face it." Clara's eyes widened, but she nodded, slipping from the bed in her stockinged feet. The floor was icy beneath them, each step a calculated risk not to alert whatever lurked. They paused at the door, Eleanor's hand hovering over the latch. The footsteps had stopped entirely now, leaving only the distant hoot of an owl and the wind rattling the shutters. With a breath, she lifted the latch. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing the hallway bathed in dim lamplight from the stairwell. Empty. Shadows pooled in the corners, but no figure loomed, no boots scuffed the runner. Clara peered out, her caution evident in the way she clung to the frame. See? Nothing. Eleanor's voice wavered, relief warring with unease. But as they stepped into the hall, a faint scuff echoed from the far end, near the attic stairs. It retreated, fading like an echo swallowed by the walls. They followed, hearts pounding in unison, the poker raised like a talisman. The attic door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning. Clara hesitated, her wit surfacing in a shaky quip. If this is a ghost, it's awfully polite about knocking. Eleanor pushed the door wider, the hinges protesting with a low whine. Dust motes danced in the intruding light, settling on forgotten crates and the trunk they'd pried open that afternoon. The letters lay scattered, yellowed pages recounting tales of a traveler lost in the winter of 1747, his steps haunting the family ever since, footsteps that sought warmth but found only empty beds. A soft thud came from the corner, behind a stack of crates. Clara gasped, pressing close to Eleanor's side. They crept forward, the air growing mustier, laced with the scent of old wool and decay. Eleanor's free hand brushed Clara's, a silent promise amid the dread. Peering around the crates, they saw it, not a spectre, but a shape huddled in the gloom, a figure wrapped in a threadbare coat, face obscured by a hood. It shifted, breath ragged, and the footsteps resumed, faint and halting, as if dragging through exhaustion. "Who's there?" Eleanor demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The figure froze, then slowly turned. Beneath the hood, eyes gleamed, human eyes, wild with fear, belonging to a boy no older than 15, his clothes caked in mud from the moors. "Please," he rasped, hands raised. "Don't call for help. I meant no harm. The storm drove me here, and the door was unlatched. I've been hiding, hearing things. The steps that aren't mine." Clara exchanged a glance with Eleanor, the tension coiling tighter. If this stranger wasn't the source, then what had been pacing their threshold all these nights? The boy's arrival marked a fracture in their world, pulling the unseen closer, as if his presence had awakened something dormant in the house's bones. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the first flakes of snow, sealing them all inside with the growing dark. The floorboards groaned under Eliza's bare feet as she crept down the hallway, the lantern's flame flickering like a hesitant heartbeat in her hand. Moonlight sliced through the cracked window panes, casting long shadows that twisted the familiar walls into something alien, watchful. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The house was silent now, save for the distant hoot of an owl in the Hollowfield woods, but the echo of those footsteps lingered in her mind, heavy, deliberate, stopping just beyond their bedroom door as if the intruder knew exactly where to halt. Mary huddled in the doorway behind her, clutching the quilt around her shoulders, her wide eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "Eliza, we should wake Father," she whispered, her voice thin and urgent, the way it always got when fear clawed at her caution. But Eliza shook her head, pressing a finger to her lips. Father had dismissed their tales last night as wind or rats, his pipe smoke curling dismissively as he turned back to his ledger. No, this time they needed proof, something solid to drag him from his skepticism. They descended slowly, each step a calculated risk on the warped treads that had creaked under family feet for generations. The air grew cooler, thicker with the scent of damp earth from the cellar below, and Eliza's pulse quickened. The footsteps had started 3 nights ago, faint at first, like a neighbor's boots on the path outside. But last night, they'd climbed the stairs, paused at the landing, then approached their room, stopping inches from the threshold, as if whatever it was waited for an invitation. At the bottom, Eliza swung the lantern toward the parlor. Empty. Chairs sat askew from the evening's fire, embers still glowing faintly in the grate. She moved to the kitchen next, where the back door stood ajar, a sliver of night air slipping in, carrying the rustle of leaves. Had it been like that before? Mary gasped softly, pointing to the mud tracked across the flagstones, fresh and clumped, not from their own boots. "It's been here," Mary breathed, her hand trembling as she reached for Eliza's arm. Eliza nodded, steeling herself. The mud formed partial prints, large and uneven, leading toward the cellar door. She set the lantern on the table and gripped the iron latch, her fingers slick with sudden sweat. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing a yawning blackness that swallowed the light. A draft rose from below, cold and stale, whispering against their skirts. Eliza took the first step down, the wooden stairs protesting under her weight. Mary followed close, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "What if it's still down there?" she murmured, but Eliza didn't answer. The air thickened with the smell of mold and something sharper, rot, perhaps, or forgotten preserves gone bad. At the bottom, the lantern illuminated stone walls slick with moisture, shelves lined with jars that glinted like eyes in the dimness. The footprints continued, deeper into the shadows, toward the far corner where old trunks and crates piled haphazardly. A scrape echoed then, not from above, but from the darkness ahead. Eliza froze, raising the lantern higher. The light caught a shape, a figure, hunched and still, half hidden behind a barrel. It didn't move, but the air hummed with presence, heavy as the footsteps they'd heard. Mary's nails dug into Eliza's sleeve. "Eliza." The figure shifted slightly, resolving into the outline of a man, or what had once been one. His clothes hung in tatters, mud-caked and ancient, his face obscured by a tangle of hair and beard. He didn't lunge or speak, he simply watched, eyes hollow in the lantern's beam, as if he'd been waiting for them all along. The footsteps, they weren't approaching anymore. They were already here. Eleanor clutched the lantern's handle, its flame flickering like a heartbeat against the damp stone walls of the cellar. The air down here was thicker, laced with the scent of mold and something sharper, earth turned too recently. She glanced back at Clara, who hovered at the top of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the faint glow from the kitchen above. "Come on," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely carrying. "We can't wait forever." Clara descended one step, then froze, her hand gripping the railing white-knuckled. The footsteps had started again that morning, not in the night this time, but during breakfast, a slow, deliberate tread from the attic down to the hallway outside their room. They'd stopped, as always, just beyond the door, lingering like a held breath. No one else in Hollowfield heard them, the neighbors had shaken their heads when the sisters mentioned it, chalking it up to the wind through the eaves or the house settling after the harsh winter. But the sisters knew better. It wasn't wind that paused, listening. Eleanor set the lantern on a crate, its light pooling over dusty jars of preserves and forgotten tools. "Papa's old journals are here somewhere. He wrote about the land before we built the house, maybe there's a reason for, whatever this is." She knelt, rifling through a wooden box, her fingers brushing leather-bound volumes yellowed with age. Clara finally reached the bottom, her skirts whispering against the steps. "What if it's not in the journals? What if we dig and find nothing but more questions?" The lantern sputtered as Eleanor pulled out a book, flipping it open to a page marked with a pressed leaf. "Then we keep looking. We can't live like this, jumping at every creak." But even as she said it, a soft scuffle echoed from the far corner of the cellar, a scrape, like boots on gravel, then silence. Clara's eyes widened, darting to the shadows where the light didn't reach. "Did you?" Eleanor nodded, snapping the journal shut. The sound had come from behind the wine racks, the ones Papa had nailed up himself before the fever took him. They edged closer, hearts pounding in unison. The air grew colder, the flame in the lantern dimming as if the darkness itself were feeding. Eleanor reached out, pushing a rack aside with a groan of wood. Behind it, the stone wall was cracked, a thin line of mortar crumbling away to reveal, not a void, but a small hollow, just large enough for a hand. Clara leaned in, her breath fogging the air. "What's that?" Tucked into the crevice was a bundle of cloth, stained and frayed. Eleanor tugged it free, unwrapping it carefully. Inside lay a child's shoe, tiny and worn, sole caked with dried mud. No, 2 shoes, mismatched, one larger than the other. And etched into the heel of the smaller one, faint but legible, M.H. 1842. The footsteps resumed then, not from above, but from within the walls themselves, closer, insistent, circling the sisters like a predator scenting fear. Clara backed away, stumbling into a shelf that rattled jars overhead. "We have to go up. Now." But Eleanor held the shoes, her face pale in the lantern's glow, a spark of something fierce igniting in her eyes. The hollow in the wall seemed to deepen, whispering promises of secrets long buried, and for the first time, the sisters wondered if the steps weren't trying to lead them somewhere after all. The lantern's flame guttered low in the drafty hallway, casting Eliza's shadow long and jagged against the peeling wallpaper. She clutched the iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a small comfort in her trembling hand. Clara followed close behind, her breath shallow and quick, while Lily brought up the rear, whispering prayers under her breath that sounded more like pleas. The house had gone unnaturally still after the footsteps ceased that night, not the usual creak of settling beams, but a silence that pressed against their ears like a smothering cloth. They'd waited until dawn's gray light filtered through the curtains before venturing out, the memory of those halting steps too fresh to ignore any longer. Eliza led them toward the attic stairs, the one place in Hollowfield Manor they hadn't thoroughly searched. "If it's rats or wind, we'll know soon enough," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. But Clara shook her head, eyes wide. "It's not rats, Eliza. You heard how they stopped, right there, by the bedpost. Like, listening." The stairs groaned under their careful steps, each riser dusted with the fine silt of forgotten years. Lily paused midway, pointing to a scuff mark on the wood, faint but deliberate, as if a boot had dragged there recently. "Look," she murmured, her usual spark dimmed by fear. Eliza knelt, tracing the mark with her finger. It wasn't from their own comings and goings, the pattern was wrong, heavier on one side. A chill slithered up her spine, not from the cold air seeping through the eaves, but from the realization that whatever made those prints had been up here before, and recently. At the attic door, the air grew thicker, laced with the musty scent of old linens and something sharper, like damp earth after rain. Eliza pushed the door open with the poker, the hinges screeching in protest. Dust motes danced in a sliver of light, revealing trunks stacked haphazardly and cobwebbed beams overhead. They fanned out slowly, Clara hovering near the entrance while Lily poked at a shadowed corner with a broom handle scavenged from below. That's when they found the bundle. Tucked behind a sagging armoire, half buried under a pile of yellowed quilts, was a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Eliza unwrapped it with care, her heart pounding as the fabric fell away to reveal a child's shoe, tiny, leather cracked with age, its sole caked in mud that hadn't fully dried. The footsteps resumed that night, closer than ever, pausing not at the bed, but at the door to their room, waiting, as if the unearthed secret had only sharpened its hunger. In the morning, Father noticed the mud on their hems but said nothing, his eyes distant. Mother fussed over breakfast, oblivious, while the sisters exchanged silent vows. They would face it together, but the cost was already carving itself into their bones. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and outside, the elder tree stood sentinel, its branches whispering promises of revelations yet to come. The floorboards groaned under Eliza's weight as she crept back into the bedroom, the lantern's flame flickering like a heartbeat in her hand. Moonlight sliced through the curtains, casting long shadows that twisted across the walls, turning the familiar room into something alien. Clara huddled under the quilt, her eyes wide and unblinking, the faint tremor in her shoulders the only sign she hadn't frozen solid. "Did you see it?" she whispered, voice barely threading the air. Eliza set the lantern on the dresser, its glow pooling around the brass candlestick they'd knocked over earlier, wax hardened now like a scar. She nodded, throat tight. Out in the hallway, the footsteps had paused again, just beyond the door, deliberate, as if listening. Not the heavy tread of boots, but something softer, irregular, like bare feet dragging over splintered wood. They'd followed the sound downstairs before, through the kitchen where the back door hung ajar, but it always circled back, ending here, at the threshold of their room. "It's closer tonight," Eliza said, keeping her tone steady for Clara's sake. She was the brave one, or so she told herself, 18 to Clara's 14, with calloused hands from farm work and a stubborn jaw inherited from their late father. But bravery felt thin now, stretched over the knot in her gut. Clara pulled the quilt higher, her fingers white-knuckled. "We can't keep running in circles." Aunt Miriam said to burn sage at the windows, but it didn't work. "What if it's not leaving because of us?" Her words hung, laced with the fear she'd bottled all week. The footsteps had started after the storm, 7 nights ago, when lightning split the old oak by the well. Folks in Hollowfield whispered of restless spirits, souls trapped in the earth from the cholera years, but Miriam dismissed it as wind and rats. Until the scratches appeared on the doorframe, shallow, like nails dragged slow. Eliza knelt by the bed, pressing a hand to Clara's arm. The girl's skin was clammy, feverish despite the chill seeping through the walls. "It's not us. Remember the story Father told? The hollow field out back, where they buried the unmarked graves. Maybe it's one of them, lost." She didn't believe it fully. Father's tales were for winter nights, to make them laugh, but saying it aloud steadied her. They had to get out, fetch help from town, but the nearest neighbor was a mile off, and the path wound through that field. Last night, when they'd tried slipping out, the steps had quickened, echoing their own, herding them back inside. A soft thump echoed from the hallway, closer this time, vibrating through the floor. Clara gasped, clutching Eliza's sleeve. The air thickened, carrying a faint, earthy scent, like damp soil turned after rain. Eliza rose, grabbing the iron poker from the hearth, its weight familiar from stoking fires. "Stay here. I'll check the door." Her heart hammered, each beat syncing with the distant rhythm outside. She edged toward the portal, the wood scarred and splintered at the base, as if something had tested it repeatedly. The knob turned cold under her palm, frost blooming where none should be. She cracked the door an inch, peering into the dim corridor. Shadows pooled at the far end, near the stairs, but nothing moved. Then, a shuffle, deliberate, inches away. Breath caught in her throat as she slammed the door shut, barring it with the poker wedged beneath. "It's right there," she hissed, backing toward the bed. Clara scrambled up, eyes darting to the window. Outside, the field stretched black under the moon, the oak's split trunk a jagged silhouette. "We go now," Clara said, surprising Eliza with the firmness in her voice. The cautious one, always second-guessing, now grabbed her shawl. "Through the window. The trellis holds, I climbed it last summer." Her hands shook as she unlatched the pane, cold air rushing in like a warning. Eliza hesitated, glancing at the door where the wood creaked, bending inward slightly, as if pressed from the other side. The first step outside was a relief, the night air sharp against their faces, but as their feet hit the grass, the sound began again, from the house, then the yard, matching their pace. It wasn't footsteps anymore, it was a rustle, like leaves underfoot, circling them in the dark. Eliza gripped Clara's hand, pulling her toward the field. "Run for the road. Don't look back." But Clara stumbled, whispering, "It's following. Listen, it's in the grass." They pushed into the hollow, the ground uneven, sinking slightly under their boots. The air grew heavier, laced with that soil scent, and the moon vanished behind clouds, plunging them into near black. Eliza's mind raced. Miriam was asleep upstairs, oblivious, her snores a faint echo they'd left behind. If they reached the lanterns of town, they could wake the preacher, burn the whole field if needed. But the rustle swelled, surrounding them, and Clara froze, pointing. In the faint starlight, shapes emerged, faint outlines in the earth, depressions like shallow graves, and from one, a hand, pale, dirt-caked, broke the surface, fingers curling toward Clara's ankle. Eliza yanked her sister back, the poker swinging wild, but the ground shifted, more hands rising, slow and inevitable. Clara screamed, the sound raw, cutting the night. They bolted, thorns tearing at their skirts, the hollow seeming to tilt, pulling them deeper. The road was close, 50 yards, maybe, but the steps, now a chorus, nipped at their heels, stopping just short, as always, waiting for them to falter. Eleanor clutched the lantern's handle so tightly her knuckles ached, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat in the dim corridor. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp stone and something sharper, like rust-tinged iron. Behind her, Clara's breath came in shallow bursts, her hand gripping Eleanor's sleeve as if it were the only tether to the world above. They descended further into the Hollowfield Manor's underbelly than ever before, chasing the echo of those footsteps that had plagued their nights for weeks, steps that creaked on floorboards long rotted away, steps that paused, always, just beyond the veil of their bed curtains. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to sidle along, skirts brushing against walls slick with moisture. Eleanor led, her free hand tracing the rough-hewn rock, feeling for any shift, any sign that this path wasn't leading them straight into the earth's maw. "It's quieter now," Clara whispered, her voice a threadbare thing. "Too quiet. Like it's waiting." Eleanor didn't turn, but she nodded, the motion sharp in the gloom. The footsteps had drawn them here, starting as faint thuds in the attic, then bolder, descending through the walls until they seemed to rise from the very foundation. Last night, they'd stopped so close Eleanor swore she felt the floorboards dip under an unseen weight. No more hiding under quilts, they'd armed themselves with the lantern and father's old trowel, determined to unearth whatever ghost or madness haunted their home. A low rumble echoed ahead, not footsteps this time, but something deeper, like stones shifting in their sockets. Clara froze, her fingers digging into Eleanor's arm. "Did you, shoo?" Eleanor raised the lantern higher, its light spilling over a jagged archway that opened into a chamber. The space was vast, unnaturally so, as if the manor had swallowed a cavern whole. Roots snaked across the ceiling like frozen lightning, and in the center stood a mound of earth, freshly turned, ringed by what looked like fragments of bone, animal, perhaps, or older. The air thickened here, pressing against their skin, and Eleanor tasted salt on her lips, though she hadn't wept. They edged closer, the trowel heavy in Eleanor's other hand. The mound wasn't random, it bore faint scratches, like letters half erased by time. "Hollowfield," Clara murmured, kneeling despite the mud soaking her hem. Her fingers hovered over the marks, trembling. "It's our name. Carved here, like a warning." Eleanor's heart thudded, sinking with the distant drip of water. She thought of the stories their mother used to whisper before the fever took her, tales of the manor's builders, men who dug too deep into cursed ground, unearthing things that walked in the dark. The footsteps weren't random, they were echoes of those buried secrets, stirring now because the sisters had lingered too long in this forsaken place. A scrape sounded from the shadows beyond the mound, deliberate, like a boot on gravel. Clara gasped, scrambling back, but Eleanor held her ground, thrusting the lantern forward. The light caught a shape, tall, hunched, cloaked in tatters of cloth that might once have been a dress. It didn't move, but the footsteps resumed, slow and measured, circling the chamber's edge. Each step ended with a pause, a listening silence, as if whatever it was savored their fear. "We can't run," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the chill coiling in her gut. She pulled Clara behind the mound, the earth cool and yielding under their palms. "It knows the way up. We have to face it." The trowel felt laughably small now, but she gripped it tighter, positioning herself between her sister and the encroaching dark. The figure halted again, closer this time, its silhouette sharpening in the lantern's glow. Beneath the hood, eyes gleamed, not human, but hollow, like sockets in a skull. A voice rasped out, not from a mouth, but from the walls themselves, a chorus of whispers overlapping, "Sisters, here, stay." Clara whimpered, pressing her face into Eleanor's shoulder. The footsteps resumed, circling tighter, the air growing colder with each pass. Eleanor swung the lantern in a wide arc, the light fracturing shadows into claws. For a moment, the figure recoiled, hissing, a sound like wind through cracked bone. But it didn't retreat, instead, it reached out, fingers elongated, scraping the air inches from Clara's hiding spot. Eleanor's mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the bones, the carvings, the endless nights of dread. This wasn't a ghost unbound, it was bound, tied to the mound, to whatever lay beneath. "The earth," she breathed, realization dawning like a blade. "It's the soil holding it. We dig, or it drags us down." Clara lifted her head, eyes wide but resolute. "Together?" Eleanor nodded, and they plunged the trowel into the mound, dirt flying in dark clods. The footsteps faltered, then quickened, pounding now like a frantic pulse. The figure lunged, but the sisters dug faster, unearthing a small, iron-bound box half buried in the roots. Inside, glinted a locket, their mother's, lost years ago, etched with the family crest. As they pried it open, a sigh rippled through the chamber, the figure dissolving into wisps of shadow that seeped back into the walls. The footsteps faded to silence, but the cost lingered. The box held not just the locket, but a brittle letter, warning of the manor's hunger for bloodlines, a curse that demanded vigilance. The sisters emerged into dawn light hours later, hands caked in soil, the quiet above deceptive. They knew now, the steps would return, subtler, unless they sealed the depths forever. But for the first time, the bed felt less like a trap and more like a bastion. Eleanor clutched the lantern's handle so tightly her knuckles ached, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat on the verge of giving out. The attic air hung thick with dust and the faint, metallic tang of old nails, but it was the silence that clawed at her now, the kind that followed those footsteps, heavy and deliberate, always pausing just beyond the threshold of whatever room they hid in. Beside her, Clara huddled against a stack of forgotten trunks, her breath coming in shallow bursts, eyes wide and unblinking in the dim light. The third sister, young Beatrice, had been the first to sense it weeks ago, her nightmares spilling into waking hours with whispers of shadows that moved without light. Now, with their parents away in the neighboring town, the Hollowfield house felt like a trap sprung shut, the footsteps no longer a distant echo but a promise circling closer. The plan had been simple at first: barricade the doors, light every candle they could find, and wait for dawn to chase whatever it was back into the walls. But simplicity shattered when the footsteps veered off course last night, thudding not toward the bedrooms but up the creaking stairs to the attic, stopping dead at the ladder's top rung. Eleanor had pulled Beatrice up just in time, the girl's small hand trembling in hers as they scrambled into the rafters. Clara had followed, her usual sharp wit reduced to frantic murmurs about ghosts and grave robbers. They'd nailed a loose floorboard across the hatch, but the wood splintered under unseen pressure, and now the lantern's glow barely reached the edges of their perch. A low scrape echoed from below, like boots dragging over warped planks. Eleanor's pulse thrummed in her ears. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling the others to stay still, though Beatrice was already rigid, her face buried in Clara's skirt. The footsteps resumed, slow, measured, each one a deliberate test against the silence. Thud. Pause. Thud. They circled the hatch, the sound growing wetter, as if something dragged a sodden hem across the floor. Rain? No, the night outside was clear, stars pricking the attic's single grimy window like indifferent eyes. Clara's hand found Eleanor's in the dark, squeezing until it hurt. "It's not stopping this time," she whispered, voice barely a thread. Eleanor nodded, her mind racing through the fragments they'd pieced together, the old tales from the village about the Hollowfield land, cursed since the fever took half the town in '42, leaving restless souls to wander. But this felt too solid, too insistent, no ethereal wail, just the patient rhythm of pursuit. They'd found the journal earlier, tucked in Father's desk, entries about unexplained noises, disappearances in the woods behind the house, and a locked cellar door no one had opened in years. The footsteps always stopped at their bed, Beatrice had said, as if waiting for an invitation. Tonight, they wouldn't wait. The scraping intensified, nails or claws raking at the board. Splinters rained down like brittle confetti, and Beatrice whimpered, clapping a hand over her mouth. Eleanor swung the lantern low, its light catching a glimpse through the widening gap, a hand, pale and elongated, fingers curling like roots seeking soil. Not a ghost's translucent shimmer, but flesh, mottled with dirt and something darker, veins bulging black beneath the skin. It withdrew with a hiss, and the footsteps retreated a step, then two, only to circle back with renewed purpose. "We can't stay," Eleanor breathed, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. She was the brave one, always had been, the sister who climbed the tallest trees and faced down the village boys' taunts. But bravery felt thin here, stretched over the fear of what that hand might pull them toward. Clara, ever the cautious planner, shook her head. The window. It's our only way. She pointed to the narrow pane, framed by cobwebs thick as veils. Beatrice nodded frantically, her wit surfacing in a choked laugh. Better to fall than be taken. They moved as one, inching across the beams, the lantern swinging wild shadows that danced like accomplices. The footsteps quickened below, matching their pace, a mocking echo. Eleanor reached the window first, shoving it open with a grunt. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and earth turned over. The drop was steep, 20 feet to the sloped roof of the woodshed, but the alternative was worse. Clara boosted Beatrice onto the sill, the girl's legs kicking into the void before she dropped, a muffled cry lost in the wind. As Clara followed, the hatch gave way with a crack like thunder. The footsteps surged upward, no longer pausing, a guttural rasp joining the thud, breathing, hungry and close. Eleanor vaulted out last, glass shattering under her palms, tumbling into the night. She landed hard on the shed's shingles, pain blooming in her ankle, but she rolled to the edge and leaped again, branches whipping her face as she crashed into the underbrush. The sisters regrouped in the woods, hearts pounding, the house looming behind them like a sentinel awakened. But the footsteps didn't fade. They crunched through the leaves now, drawing nearer, unhurried. Eleanor glanced back, lantern in hand, and saw it, a figure shambling from the attic window, tall and hunched, clothes hanging in tatters, face obscured by matted hair. Not a spirit, but something unearthed, perhaps one of the fevers lost, buried shallow and risen, drawn to the living warmth of their beds. The realization hit like ice water, it wasn't haunting the house, it was hunting them, step by relentless step. They ran deeper into the trees, the moon filtering through the canopy in silver shards, illuminating roots that snagged at their hems. Beatrice stumbled, and Clara hauled her up, whispering fierce encouragements. Eleanor's ankle throbbed with each stride, slowing her, but she pushed on, mind fixed on the old chapel a mile off, the one with iron gates and holy ground their grandmother swore repelled the restless. The footsteps dogged them, closer now, the rasp turning to a low moan that vibrated. Eleanor gripped the iron poker from the hearth, its weight a cold anchor in her trembling hand. The footsteps had returned that night, heavier than before, echoing up the creaking stairs like the tolling of some buried bell. Beside her, Clara huddled under the threadbare quilt, her breaths shallow and ragged, eyes wide in the moonlight slicing through the attic window. The room smelled of damp wood and fierce sweat, the air thick enough to choke on. They had barricaded the door with the old trunk earlier, but now it rattled faintly, as if whatever stalked them tested its resolve. "It's closer," Clara whispered, her voice a fragile thread. She clutched the locket their mother had left them, the one etched with the family crest, a Hollowfield under a watchful moon. Eleanor nodded, pressing a finger to her lips. The plan from the night before, whispered in the dark after the steps had faded, felt foolish now. Wait for it, face it, demand its purpose. But bravery was a thin veil over terror, and Eleanor's heart hammered like a trapped bird. The footsteps paused at the landing, then resumed, deliberate, each thud vibrating through the floorboards. Eleanor rose slowly, her nightgown clinging to her skin, and positioned herself by the bed. Clara slid out too, grabbing the lantern from the side table, its flame flickering like a dying star. They had found the journal in the attic trunk days ago, Father's scribbles about the Hollowfield curse, footsteps that heralded the unquiet dead, souls trapped in the earth's hollows beneath the house. It wasn't madness, as the villagers claimed, it was real, pulling at them since Mother's grave had been dug last winter. A shadow stretched under the door, long and distorted, as if the thing outside bent unnaturally. The knob turned with a slow, metallic groan, but the trunk held. Eleanor stepped forward, poker raised, her voice steady despite the quake in her knees. "Show yourself. We've waited long enough." Clara's hand found hers, squeezing tight, their palms slick. The shadow shifted, and a low rasp filled the air, not words, but a sigh, like wind through cracked earth. The door buckled inward with a crack, splinters flying like brittle bones. Through the gap, it emerged, not a man, not a beast, but a figure woven from mist and memory, its form flickering, father's coat, mother's shawl draped over hollow limbs. The footsteps it dragged were chains, rusted links scraping the wood. Eleanor's breath caught. This was no intruder, but the echo of loss, the curse their family had buried with the house's foundations. Clara gasped, the lantern trembling in her grip. "Papa," she murmured, but the figure only tilted its head, eyes like empty sockets pulling at the light. It lunged, not with violence, but hunger, arms extending like roots seeking soil. Eleanor swung the poker, the iron slicing through vapor that reformed instantly. It recoiled, a wail escaping that rattled the windows, but pressed on, the air growing colder, frost blooming on the walls in fractal patterns. Clara shouted, "The salt!" From the journal. They had lined the threshold with it earlier, a desperate ward against the unearthly. Eleanor kicked the line wider, the grains scattering like fallen stars, and the figure hissed, recoiling further, its form fraying at the edges. Together, they advanced, Eleanor thrusting the poker like a spear while Clara swung the lantern, the flame leaping to illuminate the thing's dissolving edges. "You can't have us," Eleanor growled, her voice breaking the dread's hold. "We're not yours to claim." The figure thrashed, footsteps stuttering into silence, but not before a chill tendril brushed Clara's arm, leaving a frostbite mark that burned like fire. It collapsed inward, sucked back through the door crack like smoke down a chimney, leaving only the echo of chains fading into the walls. Dawn crept in, gray and unforgiving, painting the room in watery light. The barricade slumped, the door hanging ajar. Eleanor dropped the poker, sinking to the bed, her body spent. Clara curled against her, the locket pressed between them, warm now against the cold. The footsteps were gone, the house still as a held breath. But as they stared at the frost-etched walls, a faint tremor ran through the floor, not steps, but a whisper, promising return if the hollows below weren't appeased. They would burn the journal at first light, scatter the ashes in Mother's grave, and leave Hollowfield behind. Yet the mark on Clara's arm throbbed, a reminder that some echoes lingered, waiting in the quiet.